Ready for session number 7. We're looking at Mark 1:32 through 45. So we start at verse 32 and we'll finish chapter 1 today. I've entitled it A Rapid Series of Events Begins. Jesus' fame has spread so quickly that the next event happened the same day that he threw out the demon in the man in the synagogue and he healed Peter's mother-in-law. This is later that same day. And when you look at it, there's going to be something interesting because there's a timing mark. And when evening had come, why is that critical? Well, remember, this was the Sabbath. So when the evening had come, the Sabbath was over. And now typical operations can begin. And when evening had come, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed. So this fame had spread. They even knew that he had thrown out a demon by the power of his word, his innate power that belongs to him and him alone. So they began to come, bringing their friends, their relatives, whoever had a physical need or a spiritual need, they brought to Jesus. It may be a bit of hyperbole to say that everybody has come, but the message is clear. There was a widespread response to Jesus' exorcism and his healing powers. But note that they were good Jews again, waiting until the end of the Sabbath to carry the ones in need to Peter's front door. So they waited so they would not violate the Sabbath, just as Jesus had been accused of violating the Sabbath several times during his time on earth. Verse 33, and the whole city had gathered at the door. There's the hyperbole, a little bit more hyperbole, but it just means it seemed like everybody was there. And as expected, Jesus responded, as we see in verse 34. And he, Jesus, healed many who were ill with various diseases and cast out many demons. And, same thing as in the earlier case, he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. He was not yet ready for that to be generally known. The word many, by the way, carries with it the notion of all in the Hebrew or in the Greek in this case. In other words, the implication is he healed everybody who came with a physical need, and he healed those who needed exorcism. Apparently, no ill person or demon-possessed person was rejected from Jesus' healing touch and power. His compassion was there, so this probably went on all night long. The demons, however, again, were kept from speaking, just as the first demoniac was muzzled and restrained from speaking. But at an early opportunity to exit the stage and the press of the crowd, Jesus took advantage of that, as we see in verse 35. And in the early morning, while it was still dark, he, Jesus, arose and went out and departed to a lonely place and was praying there. That lonely place, by the way, is the same description of the wilderness in which he was tempted. I'm not saying it was the same place. It's the same kind of place. He was by himself able to pray and converse with his Father as he wished with no interruption. So ask yourself this: had the title Messiah been raised at this time? And did Jesus refuse to use it? I ask this because Mark hasn't used that title at all to this point when talking about Jesus' ministry. Likely those in Galilee who had heard of Jesus and his works had only thought of him as a teacher and a healer. A very, I don't know what term I want to use. It's a very wanting thought. Yes, he was a teacher. Yes, he was a healer, but he was much more. He was Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, which Christ is the Greek equivalent for Messiah. Actually, the word's anointed, but it's a substitute for the Hebrew word Messiah. He was way more than a teacher healer, and the thought that you're seeking Jesus because he teaches and heals, and that's the only reason you're seeking Jesus, that's a defective thought process. There is much more to the man, to the God-man, and it was critical that that become known eventually, that Jesus is more than a teacher healer. He would have known of their superficial estimates of him, and he was out of the camp. He had bugged out. So let's look at verses 36 and 37 in Mark. And Simon, Peter, and his companions, we get it, hunted for him, and they found him. And they said to him, "Hey," no, that's not in there, "everyone's looking for you." So there's a bit of cutting edge to Peter's remark. Could even be slightly veiled hostility. Now remember, these guys are following him. They want him to be popular. They want him to be sought. They want him to be numero uno on people's minds. And it's almost as if Peter thought, Jesus, this is nuts. You're running away from the fame that was building. You're running away from people who come looking for you. Don't you have any compassion for them? Of course he did. And I don't know that that's what Peter thought. I'm just thinking that in the normal sense, if it's important for your guy to be top dog, you want him to show that and be around where it can be extended. By the way, this is the first time Peter appears to have shown leadership, misguided as it may have been. It may have been, it may not have been. He just simply didn't know why Jesus was bugging out away from the people to be alone. But remember that if the people did not think of him as Messiah, their thinking fell short. But there was yet another concern. Even if the people thought of Jesus as Messiah, their view, the Jewish view of the Messiah, was not Jesus' view of the Messiah. Remember, they felt the Messiah was going to come and rescue them from the Gentile oppressors. They would be raised back to top place in the world, and they would be number one as a nation. But that wasn't what Jesus was planning to do during the incarnation. Later, in the end times, yeah, that's going to happen, but not now. So, why did Jesus feel the need for prayer at that particular time? Could it have been a crisis of concern for the shallow, superficial thoughts the people had of him at that early time? We do not know. All we know is that he went to his Father in privacy where he could and prayed. Anyway, a look at Jesus' response to Peter. Let's see how Jesus responded to Peter in verse 38. And he, Jesus, said to them, that is his bunch of four, at least that bunch of four. He said, let us go somewhere else, to the towns nearby. So he said, let us get away from this crowd in Capernaum. Let us go somewhere else, to some nearby towns. Why? In order that I may preach there also. In other words, he's saying Capernaum isn't the extent of what I need to cover. For that is what I came for, to spread the word throughout all Israel. So Jesus is making very clear what you're looking at as key is not what I see as key. So Jesus' ministry wasn't confined to Capernaum. He needed to move on, away from popularity and fame, to a different task at hand, to preach on a wider basis. Exorcisms and healings were not Jesus' primary goals. They were simply tools to reach his goals, but they were not the goals themselves. Now, the people saw those as what Jesus' purpose was, to heal and to exorcise demons. But here's a question for you. Could Jesus as miracle worker, if you thought of Jesus as a miracle worker, could that lead you into heresy? Think about it. So, did Jesus adjust what he was doing? Well, let's look at verse 39. And he went into their synagogues, plural, throughout all Galilee. So this was an itinerant preaching tour, if you please. Preaching and casting out demons. So he kept on with the casting out of demons. I'm assuming, of course, that he also kept on healing. But it adds here that he was, as Jesus said he was supposed to be doing, preaching. But again, at this point, Mark hasn't told us what Jesus is preaching. Do you remember the only thing that Mark has told us about Jesus' teaching? That was when JB was thrown in the jug en route to his martyrdom, that Jesus started preaching. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent, repent, and believe. Remember, Jesus added believe to his mix. So this tour was going to last for several weeks, maybe even several months. We don't know exactly. Let me give you a little bit of that from Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 through 25. And Jesus was going about in all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. There is what Matthew adds that Mark did not. He was proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease. So the assumption we made a moment ago was correct. He didn't just exorcise demons. He also kept up his healing practice, because those powers were a verification of Jesus' authority, his innate authority from God the Father. And verse 24, and the news about him went out into all, now listen to this, Syria. Why is that different? Because those are not going to be principally Jews. They're going to be Gentiles there. And they brought to him all who were ill, all those who heard the news about him, including, I would suspect, Gentiles, taken with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics. You know what epilepsy is. Paralytics, and he healed them. No statement that he healed some of them. He healed them, and without the disclaimer of some or none, the answer is he healed all of them. Verse 25, and great multitudes followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, which again was east of the Jordan River and north of Israel as well. So these were Gentiles principally, and they were also from Jerusalem and in Judea and from beyond the Jordan. So he's saying again, Gentiles were getting into the mix in the crowd that Jesus would draw. Well, let's go on to the next event chronicled by Mark. Let's look at verse 40. Chapter 1, verse 40. And here we see something also of Jesus, his nature, his compassion. And a leper came to him, beseeching him, and falling on his knees before him. And this is, by the way, probably not to worship him, but to beg him, and saying to him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Is that actually a question asking for a healing? We'd suspect so. He didn't actually ask the question, but he fell on his knees in a begging position, saying, you can do this if you will. Don't we wrestle with that same problem? What is that? What am I talking about? Don't we look at, if we have a need, we look and say, I know Jesus and God can meet that need, but will he? See, that was the man's question. I know you can, but will you? So, this evidently is meant for us as well, telling us that, yeah, Jesus can. You need to know whether he will or not. In some cases he will, some cases he has another plan. But this was evidently an important event during Jesus' early Galilean ministry. Otherwise, Mark wouldn't have brought it up, because he's got Jesus on the move, active, strong, getting things done, moving along, drawing crowds. But why is this an important evidence of Jesus' real, true nature? Well, the first thing to consider is the man, the leper, and his condition. What about it? Well, leprosy, which would include any number of skin conditions, ranging all the way up to Hansen's disease, which is what we know as leprosy. So it may have been just some kind of skin disease, but it may have been full-blown leprosy. Yeah, leprosy is a focus of attention in Leviticus that you can read about beginning in chapter 13. So Leviticus chapter 13, 14, and on, you will read about the handling of leprosy. It was a major concern because many of those skin diseases were transmittable. And leprosy itself, I don't know how much you know about Hansen's disease, but it eats away at nerve endings, so you become without sensation. And there were examples in India, for instance, of people with leprosy going to sleep and the rats chewing their toes off. Why? They couldn't feel it, and they were sleeping. So the rats had their way. It was could be an extremely serious disease. And in that culture, if you had leprosy, you were considered unclean. Meaning what? You're restricted to an existence outside the camp. You're not let in to the city. You're not let into where the people are. You were to dress and speak in restricted ways so that when somebody looked at you, they knew you were a leper. You were also supposed to call out that you were a leper to prevent anyone from touching you. Many constraints on your life. And the leper was to touch no one as an unclean person who was likely contagious. So consider then the boldness of this man to approach Jesus. He could have been stoned for that. He fell on his knees begging Jesus for help, knowing, and he knew Jesus had the power to heal him. Either something he had seen somewhere before in Jesus' short ministry in Galilee, or he knew it from some other way, maybe from what he heard, what he saw, or what he just simply knew in his spirit to be true when he saw Jesus. What didn't he have? He didn't have confidence that Jesus would, in fact, act in compassion and actually heal him. Although if he had heard the previous story, he would have known that no one apparently was rejected from the help they needed. But again, aren't we the same way? I know Jesus can, but I'm not sure he will. And we usually try to make that sound spiritual by saying, I don't really know God's will in this matter. Well, that's just another way of saying, I don't know whether he will or not. I know he can. If you don't believe that, you got a real problem. Jesus then did something absolutely remarkable. Mark 1:41. And moved with compassion, he, that's Jesus, stretched out his hand and touched him, the leper. Jesus reached out and touched the leper. Now that should have made Jesus unclean. But Jesus said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. And as we know, when Jesus heals, the healing is instantaneous. It is complete. So when Jesus touched the man, he did not become unclean because the man had become clean. He touched the leper became clean. So, why would a priest never touch the man? Well, touching a leper would make the priest ceremonially unclean himself. So a priest couldn't do what Christ did, because the priest now could not perform priestly duties for some period of time. I forget what it is, but it's at least going to be several days, I would suspect. Then Jesus issued the command to be cleansed and healed, but when Jesus heals, again, it's instantaneous, it's complete, and it's therefore verifiable. Remember, that was what he did one time. Other than that, that act is going to continue. Jesus is always going to give verifiable proof that he is who he says he is, and he does, in fact, what he says he does. If he says somebody is healed, watch it, because you can verify that. It's not a surprise. Some things can be a surprise because they're not verifiable. We'll see that coming up relatively soon. But then Jesus gave a puzzling command again. He sternly warned him, that's the leper. He sternly warned him, and immediately, there's Mark's word again, sent him away. And he said to the leper, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest, which was required by the law. If you want to be declared clean, you have to go to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded. There was a sacrifice required. for a testimony to them. Who's the them? The priests. Christ is saying, go show yourself to the priest. Tell them what happened to you. Let them check it out. Let them know that, in fact, I healed you instantaneously and completely. He ordered the man to follow the requirements of the law, to report to the priest for an evaluation, and if he was pronounced clean, an offering was to be made. You can find that in Leviticus 14, verses 2 through 6. The offering finalized the transaction, and the man would be verified as being clean, which is what Christ always wanted. He wanted verification for what he did, what he claimed to do was in fact the truth. Part of Jesus' motivation may have been to force the priest to acknowledge his healing of that leper. The fact that Jesus' verbal response was stern may have stemmed from the fact that maybe Jesus knew the man would not obey the command, interfering with his ability to minister. Because remember, every time he does something, his popularity grows. He causes a stir. Now, when that happens, privacy is difficult, if not impossible. Perhaps the anger in Jesus' tone was because the priest would likely not accept Jesus' healing as legitimate. So here's a case now. We know for a fact Jesus can be ticked. It's a righteous indignation, but he is not above the emotion of being irritated by some event or someone. And in our final verse, verse 45, we read, but he, that's the leper, went out and began to proclaim it, the healing, freely, and to spread the news about, to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city. Why? Throngs of crowd would gather. No, there's Jesus. You know what he just did. But he stayed out in unpopulated areas. However, he's trying to get some privacy for prayer, for time with his big four at this time, trying to teach them. But this is the last part of verse 45. And they were coming to him from everywhere. And the everywhere that's been described includes both Gentile and Jewish areas. So word spread, popularity skyrocketed, a stir is being made, things are not the way they were, and so Jesus can't go about openly all the time if any privacy is expected. The term for unpopulated areas, again, is essentially the same as the Temptations' wilderness. So he's going out where he and the four can be alone, they can talk, Jesus can teach them, lead them, and Jesus can have time to pray to the Father. What did Jesus do outside the towns? Well, you can check it in Luke 5:16. I'm not going to tell you. Go find out for yourself. In the Old Testament, there are only a couple healings of leprosy, by the way. You remember what they are? One is of Miriam, Aaron's sister, Moses' sister, in Numbers 12, verses 10 through 15. Remember, that was the place where Aaron and Miriam were complaining that Moses had all the authority, all the popularity, and they felt that they were just as good as he was. So the Lord gave Miriam leprosy, and then later healed her of that leprosy. But Miriam had to suffer a time of leprosy because of her desire to be as much in leadership as Moses was. And then, and this is one that's going to come up soon. I want you to remember it. During Elisha's time, the prophet that followed Elijah, there was a Syrian general. Was he Syrian or Assyrian? I can't remember for sure. He was a Gentile general of an opposing enemy army. His name was Naaman, Naaman. He was a Gentile. He came, and remember the story, Elisha, this is in 2 Kings 5, the first 14 verses of 2 Kings 5. Elisha says, go dip yourself in the Jordan River. Naaman's response was, that filthy place, I've got better rivers back home that I can get dunked in if that's going to cure my leprosy. And Elisha says, go do it. Naaman went and did it, and he was healed by following the command of the prophet. And you're going to see later, during this period of time with Elisha, Naaman was the only person in Scripture recorded as having been healed of leprosy. Think about that. During that period of time, no Jews are spoken of as having been healed of leprosy. But here is a Gentile who was. That's going to come up in one of the very early points. As a matter of fact, haven't we already talked about it? Where Jesus went to Nazareth and he made that statement that said, I've been anointed. These things from Isaiah have been fulfilled in your midst. And then the people started talking about it and said, but wait a minute, wasn't this Joseph's son? We know this guy. Where does this power come from? And he went on, talked about that, and he gave two examples. One was a widow who needed help during Elijah's time, and the only widow helped during Elijah's time that's recorded is of a Gentile woman. Then he went to Naaman and used him as an example during Elisha's time as the only one healed, at least scripturally given verification that he was healed, was this Gentile general. And that's what made the people mad, because they realized Jesus had skipped the last part of Isaiah 61:2, where it said it was talking about him coming in judgment. But Jesus didn't give that part, and then he gave two examples, because remember, in that judgment part, the people thought that's where the Gentiles get it. That's where we get exalted as Israel, but the Gentiles get judgment. And Jesus cut that off, said, ain't going to happen now. I'm not here for that purpose. And God favored, historically, you guys have the stories of two Gentiles favored over all Jews for God's activity. One a widow, one a military general, both Gentiles. And that's what got them enraged, and they attempted to kill him. You remember we went through that a while back, talking about Jesus' baptism, as a matter of fact. So if you want to go back to look at that series again, or look at those verses again, it is the one that declares JB's baptism of Jesus. But the implication of Jesus' anger is just one more way Mark keeps our eyes on Jesus. His continuing struggle with satanic opposition. And Jesus will repeatedly show anger at something inherently wrong spiritually. And Jesus is going to be was sending the man to the priest, the one he had just healed. And that certainly raised their curiosity as to how the healing took place. Remember, There's no indication of any hocus pocus, any long drawn out formulaic words, nothing. No call on help. He just says, out. Leprosy, you're done. That's it. So healing leprosies, by the way, was one sign of Jesus' messianic ministry, something the Jews should have spotted. I'm going to read from Matthew 11, verses 4 and 5. It said, and Jesus answered and said to them, the people he's talked to, go and report to John what you hear. These were John's disciples who had come to Jesus, where John suddenly had a moment of doubt and said, are you really the one? And Jesus says, go back and tell John, JB, what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. That's what we read when we were talking about JB's baptism of Jesus, what I just spoke of a minute ago, where Jesus was in Nazareth. From Isaiah, both 61 and 58, he gave that same list. And he said, just go check it, John. You know these are characteristic happenings of the Messiah. You see them in me. Now, what's next? Well, we're going to get into very soon, in our next session, the beginning of the 5 conflicts, confrontations, in-your-face actions of Jesus relative to the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious elite. We're going to see a series of 5 events, one right after the other, where Jesus demonstrates his power, he demonstrates his compassion, and what's he doing in each of those 5 situations? He's essentially getting in their face and saying, you are wrong. You do not know what this is about. And he tries to teach them, and of course we know they do not listen. And at the end of those 5 events, which incidentally we do not know if they were in sequence, we do not know their timing. We think Mark probably arranged them here to make his point that Jesus was not the meek and mild, peaceful, backward country boy. He was in the face of the religious elite who were teaching error. He was in their face constantly. And at the end of these 5, Mark's going to point out, now there's a conspiracy, a plot to figure out how to kill this man. So that's where we're going in our next. I think we'll probably cover the 5 of them in 4 sessions. But we're coming next. It gets very interesting because you may find that you have not had a full explanation of each of these 5 confrontations. And keep in mind, Jesus was primarily responsible for each of the conflicts. They may have come for a question. They may have just come to watch and see. They may have been thinking to themselves. In every case, Jesus, up front, in your face, told them, you're wrong. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you what is right. That's coming up. We're going to look at each of those 5 with that idea in mind. Who is this man making these claims? See you.